with Ambassador Navdeep Suri, India's former ambassador to the UAE and Australia, and Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, India's former ambassador to Oman and Poland, and both former, very highly respected former diplomats of India's Foreign Service. Ambassador Suri is also an Arabic speaker. And today we are discussing the state visit of Mohammed bin Salman, the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, and the Crown Prince, of course, of Saudi Arabia, perhaps Saudi Arabia's most powerful man. And we're also talking about this connectivity corridor that was launched on the margins of the G20 summit in Delhi on Saturday, with Prime Minister Modi being flanked by the US President Joe Biden, MBS, who is Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the President of the UAE, and the ruler of Abu Dhabi, besides the European Union President, Madam Ursula von der Leyen. So let me welcome both of you, gentlemen, to ThePrint. Welcome, Ambassador Suri and Ambassador Wadhwa. Ambassador Suri, can I come to you first? The significance of this connectivity corridor and, of course, the importance of the state visit of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, a continuation of the G20 summit, as it were.
So I think the government has really made a major investment in terms of its relations with Saudi Arabia and UAE as two strategic countries in the Gulf. And it has worked very well for India. From a point where both countries were hardcore supporters of Pakistan, today they have a much larger, much stronger relationship with India. And both are looking at India from a strategic perspective. Both are looking at India from a point that this is the future in this part of the world. With the growth of the economy, with the political stability that we have, with the fact that we are now contributing to maritime security in the region, all of those things together. So I think, the visit of Mohammed bin Salman, who's also now the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, was due a few months back, but it didn't happen. I'm very happy that the government took this opportunity to extend his participation in G20 to a state visit. I think, a lot of people in India still don't understand how profound the changes that MBS is making in Saudi Arabia are, not just for Saudis, but from even perspective of countries like India. The reforms that he has unleashed are going to be game changers, and you'll see that going forward.
Okay. Ambassador Wadhwa, can I come to you now? But before I ask you to comment on the visit of Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to India, I just want to put these facts out there for the viewers of ThePrint. 10.34 million NRIs live in 210 countries abroad. But what is so interesting is that 9 million of those 10.3 million people actually live in the 6 GCC countries or in the Gulf. And that's really incredible. Of these 9 million, 3.41 million live in the UAE, where Ambassador Navdeep Suri has served as ambassador. 2.59 or nearly 30 lakh Indians live and work in Saudi Arabia. 1.02 million in Kuwait, 740,000 in Qatar, 700,000 in Oman, where you have been Ambassador Wadhwa, and 320,000 in Bahrain. And just as a point of comparison, in the US, 1.28 million Indians on NRIs live. So compared to what Indians have, the numbers of Indians who live in the Gulf, which is so much larger, and according to some reports, they send back billions of dollars worth in remittances abroad. So I don't think we should sneeze at these white-collar and blue-collar workers, Indians working abroad, Indians in the Gulf. Ambassador Wadhwa, your first comments on this, as well as on Mohammed bin Salman's visit to India.
So as you rightly said, I think the Gulf has a number of our people who work in the GCC countries in particular. And over the years, the numbers have only increased. There was a time when Saudi Arabia in particular was very much in favor of reduction in these numbers because they wanted to increase local employment. However, that has not really happened because the needs of the Saudi society have grown. And if you look around the other GCC countries also, there's been a constant increase in numbers. And that means that there is a lot of stake in our workers, in our people who work in the Gulf, as far as the Indian government is concerned. That's number one. You're right about the remittances as well. India is, I think, now the topmost country in terms of remittances from its workers abroad, according to last year's figures.
I actually looked at the last World Bank report on remittances. So the global remittances from India into India are about $100 billion, of which about 60 billion comes from the 6 GCC countries, 40 billion comes from the rest of the world, all those guys in Canada, US, UK, etc. And of the 60 billion, about 20 billion comes from UAE alone.
I mean, that's hugely significant. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think in that context, the outreach to the Gulf countries, in particular to Saudi Arabia and UAE, that India has embarked upon, I think it makes good sense. It's also very timely because of the issues that India was facing with regard to the Pakistani pressure in the OIC, with regard to Kashmir, etc. All those issues seem to be behind us now as we embark on a new kind of relationship with these countries, especially with regard to investments, trade, especially the agreement that we reached with UAE, for instance, and the opportunities that Indian companies have now got in places like Saudi Arabia, especially in terms of construction in Neom City and otherwise. And if you look at our companies there, I think there are 750 odd companies which operate in Saudi Arabia, although the investment is not much, given the size of the number of companies. But I think it'll only grow in future. And certainly the Saudi investments are growing in India. So they're looking at India as a viable market.
Right. Ambassador Suri, give me a flavor of what's going on. You said that there are things happening in the Gulf, in the Arab world, which constitute a game changer. What does that mean?
Well, would you have imagined as recently as 3 or 4 years back, not just that the Saudi women would be driving vehicles, but you would be having Pitbull doing a rave concert in Riyadh attended by 150,000 Saudis. That you would have Formula One.
And are the women all still dressed in abaya and hijab in black from head to toe?
There's been a lot of loosening on that. In fact, MBS was asked in an interview, what does he think? And he said hijab is a woman's choice. And I think the change that he has unleashed is today. I was in Riyadh 3 or 4 months back. As you enter Riyadh airport, virtually all the counters have women immigration officers. That's a sea change. You're beginning to see front end Saudi workers because the government has made it clear to the younger generation that you can no longer depend on government handouts alone. So in a country where 70% of the population is below the age of 30, MBS has managed to connect with the aspirations of the youth. Now, why do I think this is important? Beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia, take India and its own 200 million strong Muslim population and the conservative attitude of many of the ulema and many of the religious establishments that you see. When Saudi Arabia starts changing, when Saudi Arabia starts empowering women, I think it's going to have an effect here. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. Taliban 1.0, the Saudis were the first to recognize. Taliban 2.0 are still craving for the legitimacy that would come from Saudi recognition. So I just believe that what's happening in Saudi Arabia has implications for the Islamic world in general, for the perceptions of Islam, because for over 25 years, since 1979, Saudi Arabia represented the most regressive medieval brand of Islam. And that is what is copied by people by whether it's the Taliban or the jihadis in Pakistan or elsewhere. So the modernization of Saudi Arabia has implications beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. And MBS is driving that single-mindedly.
Okay. Ambassador Wadhwa, you've served in Oman. Would you say that there is a loosening up of these radical elements across the Arab world, across the Gulf? And, not just in context of MBS's visit to India, his state visit, but generally, give me a flavor of what's happening in the Arab world and these linkages with India.
So I think there is, of course, a loosening up, but not to the extent that it has happened in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE in particular. I think Bahrain is also almost there. But as far as the other GCC states are concerned, I think, it's very much status quo. In fact, as far as Oman is concerned, and I know that situation a little more intimately, we've had, a pushback from the conservative elements there, and the loosening up, which was very much evident a few years ago, has now gone back to the earlier situation.
Why is that? If Saudi Arabia is opening up and they are the holy custodian of the two mosques, then why is the rest of the Arab world not following suit?
It depends a lot on the domestic situation. In Oman, we've had a transition from a very popular ruler to another one. And it takes time for the new ruler and leadership to establish their hold before they take on the conservative elements. And I think that's the main reason there.
Okay.
Perhaps in future, we will see a further losing up. But it's also linked to how well the economies are doing. If the economy does well, I suppose these steps can be taken much more easily.
Ambassador Suri, you've served in the UAE. Now, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the UAE, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, and MBS. So MBZ and they're almost, it's like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right? Like two peas in a pod. Why are they so close? MBZ was also in Delhi. He was an observer, a guest at the G20 summit invited by India. So what is it about these two guys that you find so interesting?
Well, I think what I find really interesting is both are very clear about where they want to take their countries, their societies. These are...
Which is where?
Which is to make them more contemporary and to diversify beyond the dependence on oil alone and really create science-driven, technology-driven platforms, which both of them are trying. But I need to correct on one point. It was true until about 3 years back that MBZ was seen as something of a mentor for MBS. MBZ is a good 25 years older and had set an example of how countries like UAE could modernize while still staying in that Islamic framework. Mm-hmm. And MBS is believed to have borrowed many of those ideas that, if women drive, the sky doesn't fall. But I think there's been a bit of a falling apart over the last couple of years. I think they're both competing in the same space today. MBS, with the power that he now has and the size, frankly, of Saudi Arabia and the size of the economy, is no longer willing to play second fiddle to UAE initiatives. I think there were genuine differences in opinion and action with regard to the conflict in Yemen. And the Saudis are now being fairly aggressive in telling companies that if you want a piece of the cake in Saudi Arabia, and the government is dishing out close to $1 trillion in contracts over the next few years for their ambitious projects, then you've got to be based in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. Which means that today, if most large companies have their MENA, Middle East, North Africa headquarters in Dubai, it directly targets their interest, Dubai's interests. So you can see points of friction emerging over the last couple of years. It would be good if they patched up and moved together, because it makes the region a better place.
That's a fascinating insight about MBZ and MBS. But let me come to this connectivity corridor that was launched in Saturday. That's really interesting, and I think it's taken a lot of Indians by surprise. Ambassador Wadhwa, this connectivity corridor from India to Europe via the Gulf and via Saudi Arabia. It's officially called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. It begins in Mumbai, and there's a fascinating map that I will ask my video editor to put on the screen. It begins in Mumbai, it goes to Dubai, Jebel Ali, and then via the UAE, it crosses over into Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and then guess what? It goes to Haifa, which is Israel, and then onwards into Europe. Your first comments, Ambassador Wadhwa.
So my first comment, of course, is that this has been discussed for a while now. For a while means not more than a year. And it has been discussed also between the national security advisors of India and the United States, Jake Sullivan and Mr. Doval. And after that, it's been taken forward on the Indian side by the Deputy National Security Advisor. The proposal was fleshed out a little bit, at the G7 meeting in Japan, middle of 2023. But after that, it's got its own momentum. It's progressed quite fast, especially after the Xi Jinping visit to Riyadh, during which a number of agreements were arrived at. It has certain geopolitical implications because the United States did not want to be totally dissociated from the region, having its plate full now in the Indo-Pacific in particular. But it wanted to work with friends and others, as they call allies, in the region to set up an alternative to the Chinese BRI.
Right.
Although
this is the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese
Belt and Road Initiative. This has not, of course, been spelled out, but the idea is it goes back to having transparent and reliable infrastructure, which has been discussed in the context of G7 in the past. There are a number of players in this region, but India becomes a key player because we already involved with the North-South Transport Corridor. And also interested in connectivity projects because of the Pakistan factor in the region. Now going forward, of course, there will be a number of issues which will come up, like the viability of funding, etc.
Right.
Interestingly, Saudi Arabia has announced $20 billion already as a commitment. Mm-hmm. And that I found was particularly interesting when nobody else has come forward with a concrete figure. And that means that Saudi Arabia is indicating that it wants to be at the center of this particular initiative. Mm-hmm. I see 2 or 3 reasons behind this. One is, of course, hedging their bets as far as the United States is concerned and not putting all their eggs in the Chinese basket. Right. I suspect, something similar will happen also with the Chinese BRI project going forward, so that they are say in both camps, benefit both ways, and then can also pick and choose as to what benefits them going forward.
Right.
But for the others,
Ambassador Wadhwa, I'm just going to ask you to hold your thought. I just want to bring you in, Ambassador Suri. Now, Joe Biden, when he tweeted after the launch of this connectivity project, and he said, "I'm proud to announce that the US, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU, the European Union, have finalized this historic agreement." Now, considering that the US and Saudi Arabia haven't really been best friends these last few years since the very unfortunate killing of Khashoggi, the former Saudi journalist, why do you think that these two countries are trying to kiss and make up, Ambassador Suri? And the point that Anil Wadhwa raised, which is that it could become an alternative to the Chinese BRI or to the Belt and Road Initiative.
So, Jyoti, I think the Biden administration started on the wrong foot by describing Saudi Arabia as a pariah. And then you can say those things when you're campaigning, but they kind of stick around even when you come into power. And he was saddled with that for the first year of his administration. But I think they realized that Saudi Arabia is too important to be left out. And the Saudis played their hand pretty well by reaching out to the Chinese and making it quite plain that they had other options available. And so in the last year, I would say, the Americans have really scrambled to make up for lost time. There are I think Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and all have been there virtually every other month to Riyadh. They are trying to work out this deal of the century kind of thing of a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And a lot of effort behind the scenes seems to be going into that. And with the question marks, the speculation that will the Saudis be able to get cast iron security guarantees from the US in return for agreeing to recognize Israel, and also what does it mean for the Palestinians? So there are a lot of things happening between the Saudis and the Americans. And again,
are the Saudis biting, Ambassador Suri? Are the Saudis biting vis-a-vis the Israel?
Yes, there's been a lot of back and forth between Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Washington over the last 6 months. In particular, there's been a fair amount of speculation on the possible contours of a deal. But coming back, Jyoti, to the economic corridor, and this is really interesting. Some more details are beginning to come out. But the genesis is strangely lies in I2U2. Because when I2U2 was announced in October 21, I'd written a piece at that time about, they were talking about strategic connectivity being driven by I2U2.
So just one second, just tell us, I2U2 is
India, Israel, US, UAE as this new game in town that emerged post the Abraham Accords.
Right.
With a very clear statement about trying to build strategic connectivity. But how do you do strategic connectivity without bringing Saudi into the game? And so in May this year, you had very unusual, the NSAs of the four countries, Mr. Doval going from India, Jake Sullivan coming from Washington, Sheikh Tahnoon, the UAE NSA, and the Saudi NSA meeting together and making the first real substantive announcement about this multimodal ship-cum-rail corridor, which would be connecting. Initially, the thinking was what you said, and that was a map that I had actually put out about Mumbai to Jebel Ali to and onward by rail. But what I'm reading in the details today is it's actually Mundra, not Mumbai. And it's Fujairah, which is interesting. Well, Fujairah then bypasses the Strait of Hormuz completely. So you are, Fujairah is also in UAE, but you're not stuck with Straits of Hormuz. So you have a transshipment from Fujairah. There's a rail link. Etihad rail already goes to the Saudi border. The Saudis have built a high-speed rail link most of the way to the Jordanian border. Mm-hmm. There's a 300-kilometer stretch in Jordan, which needs to be built. And from Jordan border to Haifa, there's already a rail link. And guess who's got a terminal in Haifa but Mr. Adani?
Adani not only has a terminal in Haifa, he also has huge interest in Mundra. So it begins in Mundra.
In a sense, what I'm saying is that I would say about 7/10 of the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, is already in place. For this. So it's not a pie in the sky. And what you need to do work on is smooth transshipment arrangements, because you're taking containers off the ships, putting them into standardized gauges. Okay. You want to make sure that it's the same train that can carry through. You need to align customs. You need to align regulatory mechanisms. And I think a lot of work is going to happen on that. They're saying they're going to come back with some details in 60 days. So there's momentum behind it. I think it's fascinating from an Indian perspective that you can put stuff on a container in Mundra or in Mumbai, wherever, and receive it in Piraeus in Greece and transship it from Greece or from Marseille in France to other places in Europe.
And I've also read some reports, unconfirmed, of course, that Piraeus in Greece, the port, that India is also looking at that. And we don't know which private player, but some say Adani. We'll see. Ambassador Wadhwa, you've also served in China. So I have two questions for you. The first is the Chinese interest in Saudi Arabia, this BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative that you were talking about, the deepening of the Chinese-Saudi relationship. And my second question is about the marginalization of Iran. Where does Iran fit into this whole picture?
Well, I think there are two separate issues there, but let me answer them one by one. I think the Chinese, of course, are very interested in Saudi Arabia, not just for the BRI, but also for the fact that there is enormous amount of opportunities, economic opportunities that they see coming up in Saudi Arabia as it develops economically and puts out projects in which investors can come in. Their own construction companies see a opportunity there in Neom City and elsewhere. And plus, they also are hopeful that they will get a slice of the cake as far as the nuclear program Saudi Arabia is concerned, and the missile program in Saudi Arabia is concerned. So those are issues which are quite strategic. And if they do get a foothold over there, then of course it causes some amount of consternation in United States and in the Western countries, because of the nature of the relationship going forward. The second issue is about Iran, and of course the Chinese want to balance their interests in Saudi Arabia with those in Iran. Now, Iran is a country where the Chinese presence has been there for quite some time now. In fact, there was an announcement of a massive investment deal some years ago, details of which were not put out, but still we know that the Chinese have invested quite heavily in the port infrastructure in Iran. And also, when Iran has been isolated during this period, Chinese have made a lot of inroads into the economic situation in Iran, given the fact that there was nobody else was forthcoming at that point in time. And the Chinese did not mind that situation. In fact, it helped them get a foothold into the Iranian economy. And that continues till date. So they would like to continue with both countries as much as they can and expand that relationship with Saudi Arabia. In fact, later on with the other Gulf countries as well. In the Gulf, the Chinese interest so far for the past, I would say about a decade ago, was confined to finding places where they could sell their products and find new markets. But now, increasingly, they're looking at the Gulf more as a strategic foothold, and a place where they could get some turnaround for the Navy, for instance, in order to be able to use that in future in geopolitical terms, because they know that in the future they will need to be present in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and all the way into the African coast, given the resource transfer. So that's where the interest in these two countries comes in, essentially economic, but now increasingly also strategic and in the defense side.
So this picture that you're painting, it seems more and more like the US-China rivalry is now expanding across the Gulf and the Arab world. So Ambassador Suri, how many connectivity corridors can this part of the world take? I mean, you already have the BRI, you have the North-South corridor, which connects via Bandar Abbas from India, Bandar Abbas, then to the Caspian Sea, Astrakhan, and onwards into Russia, which the Russians would be interested in having a stake in. And now this third corridor, which the Americans are clearly pushing. So what's going on? Tell us.
Well, firstly, these are, at least in the South, these are growing economies, whether it's the Indian economy, the Saudi economy. You will see more products being created, more trade taking place. Our trade with GCC is already larger than our trade with the European Union. A lot of people don't realize it. And the GCC and the European Union as two entities are our largest trading partners. So there is, I think, room. Currently, virtually all of India's trade to Europe goes through the Suez Canal. And you saw what happened when that Evergrande, the ship got stuck.
Right.
It created a dramatic chaos and supply chain disruptions. If what people have estimated that if this new corridor is efficient and people are able to align the standards and the customs and the paperwork and all of that, and there's enough volume, what currently takes 17 to 18 days for a shipment from Mumbai to Marseille or to Piraeus could be down to 10 days. 40% is a huge saving. But what I find fascinating is that they're not just talking about a transport corridor. The MOU details that are coming out now, they're talking about fiber optic along the same route for data. They are talking about pipelines that can do green hydrogen. You have the possibility of an energy pipeline that connects green energy pipeline that connects the West Asia with Europe. So there's a lot of different possibilities that are being articulated. Still early days, but I think we should already start thinking of it beyond a physical infrastructure connectivity project.
So what happens to the attempted marginalization of Iran, and where does India fit in there?
Well, India has just helped Iran get into BRICS. We continue to maintain good relations with Iran. You saw the contacts between President Raisi and Prime Minister Modi before the BRICS summit happened. You've also seen the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Iran and UAE. I think if you look at the map of the region today, there is no doubt in my mind that it is less strained. The intra-regional conflicts today are much more subdued between Turkey on one hand, Qatar on the other side, the Arab Quartet versus Qatar. All of those things are largely behind us today. Some have been shoved under the carpet, some have been resolved. But at least I think for today, 2023, that part of the world is more at peace with itself than it has been for several decades.
Okay. Ambassador Wadhwa, closing comments now from you, and I'll ask Ambassador Suri as well. But this connection, and you've served both in China and the Arab world, like I said earlier, but as an Indian diplomat, how do you see this? Do you think that India is aligning itself much more with the Americans and with the Saudis and potentially with the Israelis, and ignoring the North-South sort of Russian connection? How do you see it?
I don't think India is ignoring anything. In fact, India is working with Iran also on the North-South corridor, trying to refine that much further, because that's something which is a separate track for India.
But can you do both? Can you do both North-South?
Of course you can. Of course you can, because the transshipment which will happen in Iran and Bandar Abbas and goes to the Caspian and then on to Astrakhan, etc., is tried and tested. It has certain problems, for example, in stuffing and de-stuffing of containers on the Iranian side because of the certain size of trucks, for example, which the Iranians use on their roads, which needs to be sorted out. Also on the outside the Caspian, when you go across the Caspian, you have to actually look at how you can diversify that trade into the other countries around the Caspian, not just Russia, because if it's only the Russian market, then you have not so much of goods and containers coming back, and that's been the main problem. The issues about translations, etc., documentation has been largely sorted out, but it's these other problems which remain still. And that needs to be made a viable corridor. So that's on one track.
Right.
This is a different track altogether. And then if you have a flow of data and green hydrogen and not only just trade from India into Europe via the Middle East, then obviously you're looking at a different ball game altogether. What I fear is that unless the countries concerned get their act together very quickly, and they think through all the difficulties that can come up, because there are many countries involved, many systems involved in this. And with the North-South corridor, we just had 3, and I've been actually associated with that for 3 years. Because I used to deal with Russia at that point in time, right. And I saw that there are enormous amount of problems because a number of ministries and players which are involved in each country can throw up some unexpected problems. And here we're talking about many more countries which will be involved, many more systems which will be involved. So we have to sort those issues out up front, and also sort out the issues of viability of funding. Right.
Ambassador Suri, closing comments from you. And I want to ask you, when Prime Minister Modi embraces Mohammed bin Salman or embraces MBZ of the UAE. What is that message? I mean, the Prime Minister is an embracer. He likes to embrace and hug people, world leaders especially. But what is the message that goes out to the Arab world and to sort of the Muslim Ummah at large?
Well, I've seen it firsthand, Prime Minister embracing MBZ on 3 different occasions, I think. And there's a lot of warmth. The chemistry between them is real. So it's something that they've come to expect. And you saw it yesterday again in the visuals at
the G20.
At the G20. I think it's not just the physical act of the embrace. It makes a nice visual and it transmits. And I saw the Arab press, the Emirati press has splashed it all over, as have the Saudis. I think it's a message to their public that this is a bond that exists between the 2 countries.
But what does that mean? I mean, how does Saudi Arabia care that this is a bond between this very poor developing country compared? I mean, the Saudis are much richer than us, aren't they? Of course, a fraction of India's population, but having said that.
Jyoti, I don't think they look at India as a very poor developing country anymore. I think that some of the things that we've not only done, but we've projected extremely successfully, whether it was a Chandrayaan mission or other things, there's a substantial change in perceptions about India. And the positioning of India on the stage today is different from what it was even, say, 10, 15 years ago. In India, the rise of India in the imagination of these people is quite real. Just to give you an example, which is a little aside on this final thought, today the Saudi Gazette splashed on its front page the report about the mega economic corridor, right? And apart from the comments in India and in Saudi Arabia, it is really illustrative to see how the Pakistanis have reacted to it. I mean, there's a lament in Pakistan. They were almost beseeching that you come and stop over in Pakistan for 4 hours, 6 hours, sign off on some of those privatization deals that Pakistan has been trying to get Saudi money for. And there is this real lament that how is it that India is making these announcements out of the blue, and they have been trying to pitch themselves for investments and nothing is happening. So
how does the GCC, I mean, MBZ and MBS, for example, how do they look at the Hindutva politics being played out in India, where especially where minorities, 200 million Muslims, how do they look at that?
So my sense, Jyoti, is that the government-to-government relations are on very firm ground, and so they continue despite some of the egregious things that happen in our country. But at a popular level, at a public level, each time you have a nasty episode in India, and the Qataris in particular are very good at playing it up through Al Jazeera's Arabic language network and through other outlets, it does get traction in the Gulf. It may not be visible in G2G relations; those continue. But at the level of the ordinary Arab, it does create a degree of dissonance because they've always looked up to India as a very secular country.
Okay. Ambassador Wadhwa, a very short closing comment from you to the same question. When you have incidents in India, especially with Muslims, lynching and other kinds of Muslims, how does the Arab world, how do Oman and the other Gulf countries, how do they look at it?
So I think it does not go down well in the general population for sure. And it depends on how the government handles it. In many of these countries, you have government-controlled media, at least in Oman you do. Right. There are very few private players in the media sector. And whatever they write is also read quite keenly because people don't want to read government handouts at the same time. But, as far as the official newspapers are concerned, you will not find the kind of criticism that you find in these other kinds of independent media outlets. And that then has its own effect on the general population. By the way, I would say that it takes only one act to actually spoil the atmosphere for a long period of time. It takes a long time to overcome it and to forget about it. And it's very difficult in the Arab world to forget about these things because there is a lot of sensitivity. And we've seen that happen with, as far as the especially the Nordics are concerned and European countries are concerned, when these sensitivities are aroused, it takes a long time to pacify. So one has to be very careful. How do you do that in a situation in which in India, every few days, in such a vast country, some incident or the other like this happens? I know in India, we're used to overlooking this fact, but not in the Gulf.
Well, I just want to thank you both for speaking so frankly and covering, in fact, the spectrum or the gamut of the relationship between India and the Gulf and the Arab world. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, thank you both so much for joining me on the Print Debates.
Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you.